Thank you, Count Corland, and thank you, Minister. As the Minister knows, the number of adults and children living in emergency accommodation funded by his department is rising. In October, there were 6,317 adults and 2,513 children in such emergency accommodation. Also, as we all know, those figures don't capture the full extent of homelessness. They don't include women and children in domestic violence refuges funded by TUSLA. They don't include adults and children in hostels not funded by the state. And they don't include former asylum seekers who have thankfully secured their leave to remain, but are trapped in direct provision, essentially using it as emergency accommodation. But whatever way you count it, homelessness is unfortunately getting worse, and more people are being forced out of their homes and into emergency accommodation, or in many instances relying on the generosity of family and friends for a couch to sleep on. At this rate, we may be back to pre-COVID levels of homelessness within a matter of months. The Minister will remember when he was on this side of the bench, his predecessor Owen Murphy stood over homeless figures rising to beyond 10,000 for a number of months. So with 8,830 adults and children sleeping in hostels and hotels in October, we are unfortunately dangerously close to that number. Now, in my opinion, the Minister's decision some months ago to lift the COVID-19 ban on evictions is the main reason why we're seeing these numbers increasing, but it is only a small part of the story. Figures from the Residential Tenancies Board show that the number of notices to quit issued by landlords each month is rising, with sale of property accounting for more than half of all evictions. Since 2017, accidental and semi-professional landlords are leaving the market in droves. We've lost over 21,000 rental tenancies as of the end of last year, and when the figures for this year are published, I suspect it will be worse again. And despite this hemorrhaging of rental supply, in my opinion, the government has no plan to slow down that disorderly exit of such properties from the market. In fact, currently, local authorities can't even buy rental properties with HAP or RAS tenants in them where the landlord is selling up, even where the landlord is willing to sell for the local authority. And we're seeing a new trend of those tenants being displaced, the properties going in the market, medium-sized institutional investors buying them and then leasing them back to the local authority for 25 years for another social housing tenant. And as supply continues to fall, rents, as we all know, continue to soar. And I'm not going to repeat the figures from either the latest Daft.ie report or indeed for the RTB rent index. But at both average statewide rents and Dublin city rents, you would need a monthly take-home pay of between €4,500 and €6,000 as a household to be able to afford that. The government's over-reliance on the private rental sector to meet social housing need is coming back to bite them with a vengeance. And unfortunately, the slow supply of social housing is also having an impact. Now, we know COVID is a significant consequence of that, but it is not the full picture. Only 35% of the targets in this year's social housing output met by the end of Q3. Procurement, tendering and public spending code issues are also delaying larger projects, and that has to be admitted by the government, and we have to address that. So, at a time when homelessness is increasing, I think it is incumbent on this House to speak with a unanimous voice and say homeless prevention has to be the key. We need to ensure every single tool is made available to families at risk of homelessness and the local authorities and the non-governmental organisations that are assisting them to meet that need. And thankfully, the Simon Communities of Ireland have come up with a very simple and sensible bill. If enacted, it would ensure that where a family or individual meets the notice to quit date and has not been able to find alternative accommodation, they would get a 3-month stay for the local authority to work with them directly to ensure they don't fall into homelessness. The bill has cross-party support. It was launched last week by 5 of the groups in the opposition. And I do understand that the Minister is supporting the principle of the bill today, and I welcome that. What I would urge the Minister to do in his remarks is to give a very clear commitment that, just like with the USI bill that was passed by opposition, that the Minister will come back and work with the Simon Communities of Ireland and the opposition early in the new year and introduce an improved version of the very same principle, if it is possible, into government legislation. That would be the quickest and most efficient way of ensuring this important protection for families and singles at risk of homelessness be enacted. If the Minister is willing to do that, we will work with you. We will be constructive, as we have always been. And let's make 2022 the year of preventing homelessness and reducing the number of families and children in emergency accommodation?
And I want to start by extending my thanks to my colleague, Deputy Owen O'Brien, not just for this PMB, which I know he has worked on with other members of the opposition, but also for his continued work in this area, which I think we can all agree is very, very valuable indeed. Minister, you know and I know that this is a sensible piece of legislation. It's, I would imagine, a relatively easy piece of legislation for you to not oppose, but I do hope that not alone will you not do that thing that the government are so fond of doing, where they don't oppose something, but that you would actually support it and that you will take action to ensure that it is incorporated into legislation at the very next available opportunity. We know that figures show that there has been an increase in the homeless numbers for the 5th consecutive month in a row. And we know from the Simon Communities and the report that they have published that there has been a 79% decrease in the availability of properties with housing assistance payment rates. So this is a real problem. The best way to prevent people from turning up to my office, to your office, when they are in that desperate situation, when they are just about to lose their home and they have no other option, is to pass this legislation and give them that time. And Minister, you will know from our own constituency that this is an issue that we face almost on a daily basis. And there certainly is not a week that goes by in my office, and I can't speak for yours, but certainly not in my office, where we don't encounter people who are desperately in need of this legislation to be passed, and indeed for the government to be as good as their word when they say they will take action, that they will actually take that action and that they will actually ensure that this is passed. And as I've said, Minister, I do hope you will clarify in your remarks not just your own position, but how you intend to ensure that this legislation is given effect to, because it's not good enough to say that you don't oppose it. We really do. And those people who are facing potential homelessness, they need to hear you say that you will support it and be proactive. Thank
you. It's a very apt time for this PMB on residential tenancies and extension of the notice period, because at Christmas our thoughts turn to home and family and children and the life that we share in those homes. I'm glad to note that the opposition is united in support for this piece of work with the Simon community, and I also welcome that you're going to accept this bill. But it's important that you implement it, Minister, because we need a radical overhaul of our housing policy and our housing system. But while we wait for that change, this bill makes a crucial difference for the currently 9 or possibly even 10,000 men, women and children facing homelessness by the end of the year. Because emergency accommodation is not a solution to landlords getting away with issuing short notice to quit. The short notice that landlords are getting away with is the problem. Because emergency accommodation by its nature is only shelter, and shelter is what you give to a stray animal or that turns up at your door late at night. People need homes. People need to move from one home to another home. And to do that, they need notice like the 3 months proposed here. Above all, I think the government needs to acknowledge the shock to the system that going into emergency accommodation is the brutal realisation that it's a hostel, a hub or the street. And the people I've spoken to in North Kildare, they're absolutely devastated when that happens to them. It goes to the very core of their family. And politicians who make light of this, who say how lucky people are to get emergency accommodation at all, knowing that they will never need it, knowing that it's never going to be them or their families or their children or grandchildren facing emergency accommodation. You know, the government love to talk about civility and #BeKind, but much of it, you know, from political quarters that see runaway house prices and rents as a sign of a successful economy. They see homelessness as the norm and emergency accommodation as inevitable. And there's nothing civil about your housing policy, Minister, and there's nothing that we should be accepting about it either, and that's why we're proposing this structured mechanism of 3 months at least to give people some kind of protection.
I'd like to commend my party colleague Owen O'Brien for introducing this bill here this evening, which is supported by opposition parties. It aims to provide an increased level of protection for those at risk of homelessness following an eviction notice by providing a 3-month extension to a notice to quit period triggered by a housing authority, which would prevent their entry into emergency accommodation. Like the primary driver of homelessness in recent years has been legal evictions and rent increases. Homelessness has increased in each of the past 4 months since the government lifted the ban on notices to quit. And this is evident in my own constituency of Cavan Monaghan, where I've witnessed a large increase in the number of people contacting my offices who have been served with such notices. The Department of Housing recently recorded 81 people in the North East region, which includes Cavan, Monaghan and Louth as homeless. And the people receiving these notices are faced with very little option in the private sector when trying to find alternative accommodation. Like, for instance, according to daft.ie across County Cavan today, there are 9 houses for rent and there are 7 in County Monaghan. And this, I fear, is only the tip of the iceberg, as I'm aware of a lot of people who could be described as hidden homeless, sofa surfing between different friends' houses or flats over long periods of time and continuously having to move from one place to the next. The lack of alternative accommodation and the rise in evictions has also forced people to remain in substandard accommodation because they're often afraid to raise serious issues with their landlord, fearing that they will be issued a notice to quit and knowing that there is such a limited number of houses or flats to rent. For those in my constituency who find themselves in need of emergency accommodation, the nearest facility is in Dundalk, approximately 130 kilometres away. It is too far away from family and there's no direct public transport route to Dundalk. We need to see more action taken to keep families in their homes and prevent them from entering homelessness in the first place. So we need to ensure local authorities have every power to prevent adults and children from losing their homes and entering emergency accommodation.
First of all, I want to commend my party colleague, Donal Bryn, for bringing forward this bill, and to Cox and to Simon Community for the work they've done on this legislation. It is vital that we start to tackle homelessness because it's absolutely soul-destroying for the people who are stuck in homelessness and for their families, and in particular the children, who don't know where they're going to spend Christmas or who don't know where they're going to be in the new year. But I want to take a moment before we go on the Christmas break to thank all those who work with the homeless and people like Cox Simon, Vincent de Paul, the new Peter McVerry Trust in Cork and Focus Ireland and many more, and especially to Katrina Toomey and all her volunteers and penny dinners. It's unbelievable the work that they do, and to the people who donate to them silently and quietly to support them. But Minister, it shouldn't be up to volunteers, it shouldn't be up to charities to be looking after the homeless. And that's why this bill will send up a clear message if the government does actually go the whole way and not just support it, but to implement it. I think we need to recognise all these volunteers for the tireless work they'll do Christmas. These people will deliver tents, sleeping bags, dinners, snacks to people at all hours of the day and night. And they're not in it for the recognition or the thanks, they're in it because they believe that's the kind of country and state we should live in. They recognise that no one in this state should go to sleep on Christmas Eve without a roof over their head, but unfortunately they will. We know groups, and we owe these groups and volunteers a huge debt. And for many, a tough Christmas will be made slightly easier because of the work of these volunteers and these groups. Minister, I hope you and the government will do the right thing.
I commend the work of Deputy O'Brien and all involved in bringing this to the floor of the Dáil this afternoon, and I want to commend the Simon community for the work that they're doing. The automatic extension of notice periods for residential tenants where the tenant is certified as being at risk of homeless is a really important intervention. My own constituency of Longford Westmeath is not immune from the rise of homelessness that we have seen, and Westmeath implements that devolved regime for the Midlands homelessness, and at the 30th of November there were 83 people in emergency accommodation, 35 from Westmeath alone. Now, each of those individuals is a life turned upside down and devastated by the impact of homelessness. And taking action to keep families in their home and prevent them from entering homelessness in the first step is vital. And I want to tell you what impact this will have. Last week, a young woman in her early 20s, I'm going to call her Annie, came into my office. She had 48 hours to leave the room that she had been renting. She was desperate. She had literally tried everything in her power to stay in that property and to source another one. And I am not exaggerating when I say she was shaken like a leaf. There was no tears. She actually had none left. There was a young woman, almost broken, racked with dry sobs. Now, she spent the last 5 days in a hotel and she's been told she needs to leave by Thursday. There's no beds available in emergency accommodation. There may be a tent and there may be a sleeping bag available for Annie. Now, any property that's likely to come up will not be until the new year. So we're now faced 3 weeks with trying to plug a gap over Christmas. Now, to me and to any person with an ounce of decency and an inch of morals, that does not look like a tent or a sleeping bag. Now, I will vote in favour of this bill. I'll vote in favour of it for people like Annie and for the countless like her. For those who have sold their belongings, gone into emergency accommodation. For those who are dreading the notice to quit coming in the door because they know it's on the way. For those who are sofa surfing, and for every child who comes Friday week will ask us, how will Santi find us?
It's a terrible indictment of the government's housing policies in general that so many people are living a hair's breadth away from being made homeless. People's lives are so finely balanced that it would not take much to tip them into homelessness, and within the rental sector this has become even more prevalent, with so many landlords leaving the market at present. Recent data from the Residential Tenancies Board shows that 77% of those whose tenancy was terminated in the last 3 years was because the tenant was informed that the landlord was selling up the property or because they or their families were moving into the property. Figures show that 550 landlords left the market this autumn alone, which is around 46 a week leaving the market. This year alone, 2,080 landlords have left the market and 1,902 landlords left in 2020. This is clearly having a huge impact on tenants and their security of tenure and on their well-being and mental health. Landlords selling their properties has been one of the main causes of homelessness over the last number of years. With property prices being so high at the moment, it's no surprise that many landlords would choose to sell up rather than continue to rent out the property. According to Focus Ireland, responses by successive governments have maximised a sense of grievance among landlords while doing little to improve security of tenure. This bill addresses in some way this imbalance by providing a person or family at risk of homelessness within a 3-month extension to their notice period. This proposal is also intended to give local authorities and the families concerned some breathing space in helping a family in danger of being made homeless to find alternative accommodation. I'm glad to hear the government is not opposing this bill, as well as members of other parties. Well done to Simon and to Eoin O'Brien for bringing this forward. Thank you.
Minister, I'm happy to hear that you are supporting this motion, or certainly allowing it to go through. The purpose of the proposed legislative amendment below is to provide an increased level of protection for those at risk of homelessness following an eviction notice to prevent their entry into emergency accommodation. And just this evening at 6 o'clock, an email came through, and the person said, "I was wondering if you could help me. I've been sofa surfing on my friend's sofa with my 1-year-old daughter. I sleep in my friend's house the odd time, but they're both overcrowded, and unfortunately I can no longer stay in either places. I've tried getting onto the council, but unfortunately they're unable to help me get into emergency accommodation. They keep telling me they'll contact me, and still nothing. It's a week before Christmas, and I'm really worried that I'm going to be on the streets for Christmas." That's an absolutely heartbreaking situation for a mother and her child, to be going around the streets and the city of Dublin fearing that they're going to be homeless for Christmas, and relying on their friends, their neighbours and people that they know to keep them in accommodation. I also looked at accommodation for Dublin 15 just before they came through, and there were 32 units available. on daft.ie. Not a single one of those housing units, not one, was available for any of the HAP limits that are in place at the moment. So if you're homeless, or if you're at risk of homelessness in Dublin 15 at the moment, you have absolutely nowhere to go except homeless accommodation, and even that people are struggling to get through. So it's therefore no surprise that homelessness among adults and children has increased in each of the past 4 months. Overall, there's only 190 properties available under a standard or discretionary limit in at least one of the 4 categories that were available. It represented a decrease of 79% on the 906 properties that were available within at least one HAP category in the June study. That decrease is directly related to the dramatic rise in the notices to quit since the government lifted the ban on such notices. As I said, this bill is a small but important change to the Residential Tenancy Act, and it's supported by the 5 opposition groups. And again, I'd like to commend Simon, like everybody else here today, and I'd ask that the government do allow this to go through, but actually goes forward by enacting the measures required to help families and individuals and stem this homelessness crisis. Congratulate
Deputy O'Brien and the Simon communities, and welcome that the government aren't going blocking it. But the bill itself, it highlights seeks to address the immediate crisis that people are faced when they are being given notice by their landlord. And I to put it into context, in Tipperary, my own constituency, the number of people classed as homeless, and in the government's own monthly homeless figures is 33 to 45. That's over a third of a rise. Yet thousands of people are on the housing list, waiting on the rental market, and it's non-existent. And I appreciate, and I get on great with the half finals blow in Tipperary, but they will tell you their hands are tied. There is no properties out there. I just on DEF earlier, there are 16 properties in the county the size of Tipperary for rent. We have over 400 people on waiting lists down there. So we can have a review, and it seems to be a buzzword for this government, a review. I'd love to know actually how many reviews from all strands since they took power, because everything, when there's a problem, we'll have a review. Families are struggling as it is. They're in fear, as Deputy Donnelly said, families coming up to Christmas time, that they are under severe pressure, and the government must act on it, right? Look, at the extension would be triggered by the housing authority themselves, and they can get in earlier, because that's where the worry is, that people are actually having severe worries, not just Christmas time, all year round, that suddenly the tenancy is up and they have to get out. So, look at it, like I said, it's an atrocious situation to see people in situations like that, and they're the people that are hidden from the government's figures on a monthly basis. So, like I said, I commend Deputy Donnelly, or Deputy O'Brien and the Simon communities, and welcome the government's stand on it, and hope they support it more. I
want to start by thanking the Simon community, who provided vital service to people experiencing homelessness throughout Ireland, and particularly my own area, the South East region, since 2004. Their unwavering commitment to justice and equality and protecting some of the most vulnerable people at risk in our communities cannot be underestimated. These pillars of equality and justice are evident in the Residential Tenancy Amendment Extension of Notice Periods Bill 2021 that we are discussing tonight. Homelessness challenges the nation's moral compass, as we cannot ignore the fact that in our modern era, one of the main causes of families being put out on the street is the enormous rise in rents, which simply equates to greed and avarice by vulture funds and wealthy investors. In my own county of Wexford, there were 767 calls to the Homeless Service and Support Unit between January and November of this year alone. According to the government's own figures, there were 23 individuals recorded as homeless in County Wexford as of the last week of October this year. However, we know this figure is far greater, because it doesn't include sofa sufferers or citizens living temporarily in relatives' or friends' houses. This bill will provide a buffer zone to protect people who are in immediate threat of becoming homeless. If passed, it will provide for the automatic extension of notice periods for residential tenancies where a tenant is certified as being at risk of homelessness, and crucially allows a local authority to directly engage for a 3-month period with a person or family who is at risk of homelessness. I know from my own experience on the ground that notices to quit are alarmingly on the rise and are responsible for creating a high percentage of homelessness or risk of homelessness. Until the government gets a grip with the private rental market and the financial forces that run it, they will continue to fail in addressing this problem. The bill proposes a change that would act as a barrier and protection factor for those who find themselves in dire straits and give greater assistance to the local authorities' housing departments, whose hand is often tied behind their backs as they try to support families and children in desperation and facing homelessness almost at the 11th hour. This must change. Again, I would like to commend the Simon community, my colleague Deputy Ona Bryn, and all my colleagues in this House who supported this bill to this point. And I welcome the government's support, but it must be followed up on by immediate action.
Thank you. And Deputy Ward. Minister, we in Sinn Féin are criticised by government for not providing solutions to the issues of the day, but week after week and day after day we come to this chamber with viable solutions on housing, on health, on mental health, on education, on practically everything. In fact, our spokesperson for housing and my constituency colleague Ona Bryn has provided that many solutions on housing that he's wrote a couple of books on this matter. I don't think I've ever bought a Fianna Fáil TD, a Christmas present, but I might just do it this year in relation to one of the books that Deputy O'Brien has written. It is the season after all. This bill is a small but important change to the Residential Tenancy Act and is supported by the 5 opposition groups in the Dáil and the Simon community. Homelessness among adults and children has increased in each of the past 4 months. And that increase is directly related to the dramatic rise in notice to quit issued since the government lifted the ban on the notices. I was at the Children's Committee earlier today, Minister, and we heard about the impact that poverty was having on children. And one of the main contributions to children being in poverty is the housing crisis. Like we heard about the poverty of homelessness, we heard about the poverty of good quality accommodation, we heard about the poverty of secure accommodation. And the Rialto Youth Project spoke at today's meeting that this poverty is like a child being in a bubble. And it touched me that much that I said I'd bring these words into the chamber today. So they spoke about this bubble. The bubble, we're inside it. You see everything and everyone through the bubble. And everyone sees the bubble when they look at you. They make decisions about you. They tell you you can't. They tell you you won't. They tell you you'll never. They measure you with invisible rulers. You will come to love the bubble. You will come to hate the bubble. What does your bubble feel like? My bubble feels like a shell on my back. It's heavy. I hope yours is light and floaty and beautiful. And I hope it's easy to get out of. Out of the mouths of babes, Minister. These are the words of children. And passing, not just passing, but passing and enacting this bill today will help these children get out of this bubble. We need to see more action taken to keep families in their homes and prevent them from entering homelessness in the first place.
Ara, there's a scenario that has become far too prevalent. Imagine your landlord issues you with a notice to quit. Anxiety sets in as you desperately search for somewhere to live, but you can't find anywhere you can afford. Your housing assistance payment isn't sufficient to cover any of the rents you see available. The clock ticks down and soon enough you find yourself in the situation of homelessness. You present as homeless to your local authority, a devastating prospect for any family, and sometimes I think we need to really think about about that reality and how it feels for any individual or family. And Ara, this has become an all too common reality for many of our citizens. Currently there are 61 families in Galway City who have received a notice to quit and who have presented to City Hall in need of assistance. These are families who are now facing incredible fear and anxiety over Christmas, with huge uncertainty of what will face them in the new year. And this bill would give them much relief. These 61 families are in addition to those who are currently in homeless accommodation, with 27 families in homeless hubs and 53 families in private emergency accommodation. That is a total of 80 families facing into Christmas without a place to call home. And as we know, so many of the people who are in homeless accommodation, they're told to look for HAP accommodation. But the reality is that often there are no properties available under the HAP limits, and that's something that keeps coming up in Galway City. And this is a precarious housing situation that this government and its forebears have created. We've seen in Galway City that more has been allocated again this year for homeless emergency services. But the reality is, while this is a further year-on-year increase and is needed, it doesn't address the actual need of the people. It doesn't address the need for more bills. And I'm pleased to see that the government aren't opposing this here tonight. And I think it's fantastic to see cross-party solidarity in putting forward this bill by the Simon community. But we need action. We can't have a situation where each Christmas homelessness is discussed in this chamber and people say how terrible it is, but very little is done about it, and the following year it is discussed again. So I hope that this bill is the start of something, of a new collaboration between government and the opposition to tackle homelessness.
Look, like everyone else, I'd like to thank the Simon community for this bill. I do welcome that the government are talking about delivering on the substance of the bill very early in the new year. We obviously need to make sure that this happens. What we're talking about here is people who are facing notice to quit and the possibility of homelessness. And what we have a failure in here sometimes, what many governments have failed to do, is to deliver those early interventions. This is to stop people falling into homelessness. It's that idea of a 3-month extension. It's that local authorities will engage and we can stop the problem before it becomes a much wider problem. This is not a silver bullet. This is a very simple solution, but it just needs to happen. Like we all know, next weekend the Simon community will get great support in relation to their fundraisers. I know that in the Cooley Peninsula, Councillor Anton Waters invited me out where there's a fundraiser going on and a sleep out for Peter McVerry Trust. And look, people are very good, but we need to deal with the actual issue. And we have much bigger issues. We also accept this is a small step. We accept that we need to deal with the supply. That goes without saying. Everyone's been on the record in relation to that. But I'm just going to deal with the fact that we don't have a sufficient amount of homeless supports. I know a huge amount of people where vulnerable people have been put into houses. The supports haven't been put around them. Terrible things have happened. We have issues of criminality and antisocial behaviour and a need for the state beyond the local authority. And I know all sorts of the guards and mental health services that are required. But if we do not put in the supports, we'll get issues like I got in my own town in the last while, where 2 houses literally went on fire. 2 vulnerable people who were used and abused by other criminals, and then what happened? We end up with a complete disaster. And the people that have had to live with those situations, it's utterly, it's unacceptable. We also have to deal with the issue of the thresholds in relation to getting on the housing list. We know the difficulties of how it's assessed at the minute. I've spoken to Minister O'Brien and Minister Burke in relation to this. The solution needs to be expedited. There's absolutely, and the other major issue is, I know people who would stay in their parents' house, but they can't at this point in time. They're afraid of losing the time on the housing list. So therefore, they are taking from what's already a limited amount of houses in the private sector. We have a lot of solutions. Here's one, needs to be done. Sinead.
Thank you, Minister. First of all, I'd like to start my conclusion just again by thanking Wayne Stanley and the Simon Communities of Ireland for this simple but very important piece of legislation. I also want to acknowledge all of the members of the other political parties on the opposition who co-signed the bill, from Labour, from the Soc Dems, from the Independent Group, from People Before Profit, Solidarity, as well as my own colleagues. Everybody has said that a bill like this would be useful, that it won't solve all of the problems, but it will give us another tool to try and help some of the problems and help some of the people affected. And because I'm the kind of person who takes people at their word, I accept all of the government spokespeople who have spoken on this tonight. The issue, however, is not whether any of us mean what we say, it's whether we do the things that we say we will do. And I have to say, if we allow this bill meander through committee for months and months and months, it's of no value. I would really urge the Minister to discuss with his colleagues in the department if there is a way for the government to take the spirit of this provision and work it into legislation that the government themselves are going to enact early next year. That means your officials will be able to deal with all of the deficiencies that you and Minister O'Brien outlined, but it also means that the provisions will become law. We did that with the Union of Students of Ireland bill earlier this year, as well as back when Owen Murphy was Minister. I want to finish by saying this, last Ceann Comhairle, those of us who have been in this House just a little bit longer than the current Minister of State do have a terrible sense of déjà vu when we have these debates, where we are told of the commitment of government, where we are told of the very long list of actions and the very high levels of expenditure they're going to be mobilised to address the housing and homelessness crisis. And yet, month on month, year on year, the problems get worse. Minister O'Brien was absolutely right. There was a very significant drop, in particular in family homelessness, in the first year and a half after COVID. There is a simple reason. It's not because of any of the policies of the previous government or any of the policies of this government, other than an emergency ban on evictions because of COVID-19, public health measure. A public health measure which many of us had been arguing for as a social policy emergency measure for many years. Homelessness fell by 60% across the state. In some areas, family homelessness fell by as much as 80%. And the difficulty is now that all those protections have been lifted, month on month, the figures are rising in exactly the same way as they were when Owen Murphy was Minister. So I will work constructively with anybody to try and tackle this crisis, but we will all be judged by our actions, not our words. And let's make sure in the weeks ahead our actions match the words that we all used here tonight. And as I said at the end of my opening remarks, let's make 2022 the year of preventing homelessness and the year of dramatically reducing homelessness. Thanks, Ceann Comhairle.
Close the debate now. The question is that the bill be read a second time. Is that agreed? Agreed. Agreed. Garmil Mark.